In the scorching heat of the Arizona Territory in 1877, a young woman named Elizabeth Morrison worked her family's small farm with calloused hands and a heavy heart. Her father had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving her alone on a patch of land that bordered what had once been free Apache territory. At 22, Elizabeth was considered past marriageable age by the standards of her community, a fact that troubled her less than it troubled the well-meaning townspeople who frequently reminded her of it. Elizabeth was painfully shy, a trait that had only intensified after her father's death. She avoided the town whenever possible, preferring the company of her chickens and the 2 aging horses that pulled her plow. Her blonde hair, usually braided and pinned up beneath a bonnet, and her pale complexion marked her as different from the hardy, sun-bronzed women who seemed to thrive in the harsh frontier environment. She spoke little, even when spoken to, and the few young men who had shown interest in courting her had quickly lost patience with her stammering responses and downcast eyes. The Apache people had been forcibly relocated to reservations, but everyone knew that some warriors had refused to go, choosing instead to live in the wild places, moving like shadows across the land their ancestors had inhabited for generations. Elizabeth had seen signs of their presence: tracks near her water source, the occasional feeling of being watched, once even a small bundle of herbs left near her door that she later learned could treat fever. It was on a late summer evening, as the sun painted the desert sky in shades of amber and crimson, that everything changed. Elizabeth was drawing water from her well when she felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes upon her. Her heart hammering, she turned slowly to find a man standing at the edge of her property. He was Apache. That much was immediately clear from his traditional dress and bearing. He wore a magnificent headdress adorned with eagle feathers, a breastplate of bone and beads that told stories she couldn't read, and carried himself with a dignity that made her feel small and insignificant. Elizabeth's first instinct was fear. Stories of Apache raids, though mostly exaggerated and often untrue, had been part of frontier lore for as long as she could remember. But something in the warrior's stance suggested he meant no harm. He raised one hand in a gesture of peace, and Elizabeth, trembling, managed a small nod of acknowledgement. His name, he told her in surprisingly good English, was Nate, which meant mischief maker in his language, though there was nothing mischievous about his serious demeanor. He had been watching her farm, he explained, watching her work alone, watching her treat the land with respect rather than simply exploiting it. He had seen her leave water out for the wild animals during the drought, had seen her replant native grasses along the creek bed, had observed her gentle treatment of her animals. Over the following weeks, Nate appeared regularly at dusk, always maintaining a respectful distance, always ensuring Elizabeth saw him approach so as not to frighten her. Despite her shyness, Elizabeth found herself looking forward to these visits. Nate spoke of his people, of their history and struggles, of the life that was being systematically destroyed by the encroachment of settlers and the policies of the government. He spoke without bitterness, but with a profound sadness that Elizabeth felt in her own heart. She began to respond, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. With Nate, her usual tongue-tied awkwardness seemed to matter less. He listened with patience when she struggled for words, never rushing her, never making her feel foolish for her difficulty in expressing herself. She told him about her father, about the loneliness of the farm, about her fear that she would live and die in isolation because she couldn't overcome her crippling shyness around people. As autumn approached and the evenings grew cooler, Nate began to help with tasks around the farm. He would appear silently and work alongside her, repairing fences, moving heavy objects, showing her techniques for water conservation that his people had perfected over centuries. Elizabeth knew this was dangerous for both of them. If townspeople discovered an Apache warrior on her property, there would be consequences she couldn't predict. But she found she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. It was on a clear October night, with stars scattered across the sky like handfuls of diamonds, that Nate spoke the words that would forever alter Elizabeth's destiny. They were sitting on her porch, a respectful distance apart as always, sharing a simple meal of bread and dried meat. The comfortable silence between them was broken by his deep, measured voice. "I want a child from you," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face, then rush back in a burning flush. Her hands began to shake so violently that she had to set down her cup. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her shyness, which had retreated somewhat in Nate's presence, came roaring back with paralyzing force. Nate continued speaking, his voice gentle but firm. He explained that he was the last of his immediate family line. His parents had been killed in a massacre at a peaceful encampment years ago. His brothers had died fighting to protect their homeland. His sisters had succumbed to disease on the reservation where conditions were deliberately kept harsh. He carried within him the knowledge of his people, songs and stories and wisdom that had been passed down through countless generations. If he died without children, all of that would die with him. He had chosen Elizabeth, he explained, because in her he saw qualities that were rare and precious. Her gentleness with all living things, her respect for the land, her ability to endure hardship without becoming hardened by it, her quiet strength that she herself didn't recognize. These were the qualities he wanted in the mother of his children, qualities that would help ensure his offspring could survive in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to his people. Elizabeth sat frozen, her mind reeling. The proposal was shocking, impossible, went against every convention she had been raised with. A proper woman didn't even consider such things outside of marriage, and certainly not with a man from a culture so different from her own. But as she looked at Nate's face, serious and hopeful and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before, she found herself considering the impossible. She tried to speak several times, her voice emerging in broken whispers and half-formed words. Finally, she managed to ask the questions that burned in her mind. What would this mean? How could they possibly make such a thing work? What about the dangers they would face from both their peoples? What kind of life could a child have, caught between two worlds that were at war with each other? Nate answered each question with honest directness. He would marry her in whatever way her culture required, though he would also ask her to participate in the marriage customs of his people. He understood the risks, but he believed they could create a safe place on her farm, away from the eyes of those who would judge them. Their child would be taught both ways, given the tools to navigate both worlds. It would not be easy, but he believed it would be possible. Elizabeth spent sleepless nights wrestling with her decision. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that the risks were too great, that she should send Nate away and never see him again. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant her entire life, whispered something different. It whispered that here was a chance for something she had never dared to hope for. A partnership with someone who accepted her exactly as she was, who didn't demand that she be anything other than herself. After a week of agonizing deliberation, Elizabeth gave her answer. She found Nate at their usual meeting spot, and though her voice shook and tears streamed down her face, she managed to say yes. The smile that transformed Nate's usually solemn face made her heart soar in a way she had never experienced. What followed was not a conventional courtship by any measure, but it was theirs. They were married twice, once in a quiet ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who asked no questions as long as his fee was paid, and once under the open sky according to Apache tradition, with words and rituals that Elizabeth didn't fully understand but felt the profound significance of. Their union had to be kept largely secret. Elizabeth told the townspeople that she had married a ranch hand who worked on the property, a lie that seemed to satisfy their curiosity while keeping Nate's true identity hidden. He lived in a hidden shelter he had built in a canyon near her property, coming to the farmhouse only under cover of darkness. It was a difficult arrangement, but they made it work. When Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant, both joy and terror filled her heart. Nate was elated but also deeply concerned for her safety. He became even more protective, teaching her traditional Apache remedies for pregnancy ailments, ensuring she had everything she needed. Elizabeth's shyness made it easier to hide her condition from the townspeople, as she rarely went into town anyway. Their son was born on a spring morning, delivered with the help of an old Apache woman Nate trusted, who disappeared back into the wilderness as silently as she had arrived. They named him Samuel Nate Morrison, blending both their worlds in his name. He had his mother's lighter skin and his father's dark eyes, a visible bridge between two cultures. The years that followed were filled with challenges Elizabeth could never have imagined. They faced suspicion from townspeople, danger from both Apache raiders who saw Nate as a traitor and settlers who would have killed him on sight had they known his true identity. But they also experienced joys beyond measure. Elizabeth watched her shy, quiet nature transform in motherhood, finding a voice she had never possessed when it came to protecting her son. Nate taught Samuel the ways of his people while Elizabeth taught him reading and farming. The boy grew up bilingual and bicultural, belonging to both worlds and neither. There were close calls, times when they thought their secret would be discovered, times when they had to make difficult decisions about where to go and how to live. But through it all, Elizabeth marveled at how a single moment of courage, a single yes spoken through tears and terror, had given her a life richer than she had ever dreamed possible. The shy farmer who could barely speak to strangers had become a mother, a wife, a bridge between cultures. She had found strength in the most unlikely of partnerships, with a warrior who had seen in her quiet nature not weakness but a different kind of courage. Together, they had created something that should have been impossible. A family, a home, a small pocket of peace in a world torn by conflict. As Elizabeth watched her son play in the fields where she had once worked alone, watched Nate teach him to track animals and read the sky, she often thought back to that October night when impossible words had been spoken. She thought about how close she had come to saying no, to choosing the safe loneliness she had always known over the risky uncertainty of love. And she thanked whatever forces had given her the courage to choose differently, to say yes to life when everything in her wanted to hide from it. Their story would never be recorded in history books, never be celebrated or even known beyond their small circle. But it was real, and it mattered, and it proved that even in the darkest times, even across the widest divides, love could find a way to take root and grow.